Florida. And I think there is only one important sentence to describe Florida. I know that she has done a lot of different work, and our friends at the Migrants Forum in Asia have a long-standing friendship, if we can put it in this way. And she's a long-time civil society activist in the area of migrants, and she has done a lot of work in Malaysia, a country that we know has a large number of migrants, diverse groups documented, as well as a large number that still remains largely undocumented. And Florida, we just wanted to ask you if you could just you know, having had the discussion now, and Henry just pointed out a very important issue in the role of community, the role of diaspora. And also maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what you saw in your experience in terms of return case management. How did that work in your experience? So really talking about how the migrant experience is like in terms of them integrating into their space, but then also what happens when the decision, whether it's made by them or not, has to be made to return home. So what kind of cases, you know, what kind of, we would say, specific things did you sort of observe? What was the role of the community in sort of providing the necessary support? And I think you could also talk to us a little bit about the gaps and the challenges that you have seen in terms of improving case management. Florida, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I think that's a very good opening for me as well. And you know, I would really love to take this opportunity to share with you the best lesson that I have actually learned individually about migration. In fact, when I first went into a migration project, I was clueless. I had no idea what I was doing. But the best thing that ever taught me is actually walking through and walking with migrant workers. They taught me a lot of things that you at least see in books or you read. And that was one of the greatest challenge that actually started off in the migration process when I first joined in. And Malaysia, as you have rightly pointed out, it's actually a receiving country, and the challenges here is really, really great. There's a lot of lessons to learn, and there's a lot of work need to be done. As the first speaker pointed out, clearly there is a lot of complexity in migration process itself. But the way the country looks into migration, they look into in a very narrow scale. You know, it's either you are documented, you're a migrant worker, you are here to work, or you are illegal. You know, they put you in that kind of a lump. And that creates a lot of complexity in decision making, in advocating for their rights, and also in terms of fighting for their rights through the MRC work itself that I have actually seen. Now, for instance, if you look at refugees and asylum seekers, so in Malaysia, in Malaysian context, for example, until and unless you have the refugee status recognition given to you, it has some form of advantage, some form of protection. But nevertheless, if you look at the law itself, it's a bit complex. It's not fully protecting their rights, you know, in terms of they are left out in a lot of benefits. For example, in the workforce, they are not recognized while they are allowed to stay and reside in the country, but they're not allowed to be in the workforce. So how are refugees are going to survive if they're not allowed in the workforce? This is just a tip of an example. And the migrant resource centers actually played a huge role, because you can talk to any civil societies out there. They will tell you that a migrant worker will not be able, in most cases, will not be able to defend himself on his own. He definitely need some help. There are migrants who have been able to, go. If they're documented, they have some leverage to defend themselves on their own. But if they're undocumented, it poses a lot of other challenges as well. So it's a challenge. It's a big challenge. So you can see, and some of them is also ignorance. Even if you're undocumented, there are laws that is actually protecting you. But to a migrant worker, he doesn't see that, because what he sees is that, look, I'm undocumented, whatever venues I go to, even for health, even for COVID, You know, it was one example. If he wants to go, he feels that he's not well. He needs to be tested, or he needs to be, you know, screened if he had COVID, or maybe he could suspect, or he may not even have that. But if he goes to the hospital for check, one of his fear is, will I be arrested? You know, that will be his greatest fear. So if you have, you know, in Malaysia we have this movement control order. So if you have a cluster of a group of migrant workers who has infected with COVID-19, rest assured, if you have undocumented migrant workers within the group, they'll be the first one to flee. And you know, that tells you a lot. But I think COVID-19 is a lesson that we all should learn. It does not discriminate, but you know, the policies does. So where are we? Where are we in this whole scenario of undocumented worker? But another most important thing I wanted to say is that when we do research, when we do findings, most of them do not, especially research done by the government, the undocumented migrant groups of workers, they are refugees, asylum seekers, stateless person, name it, you know, a lot of them, they are not captured in any data. So when you don't capture this, how do you move to have a very transparent and very effective social dialogue for us to come to make a decision? So the challenge and the complexity is huge. I mean, it's, for me, maybe later down the road, if you know, if people wanted to know, there's a lot of aspects why migrant workers become undocumented, and why, you know, some documented become undocumented, some do come in undocumented. There's a lot of issues, a lot of complexity. This is something that a lot of people don't understand, sadly, except for civil societies and people who are advocating for that. You don't see the lawmakers looking into it. You don't see the government looking into it, or person ministry is looking into it. But overall, the scariest part, especially in the light of Malaysia, is that migration is looked in the point of security. So when you look at security, everything is watered down. The decision is watered down. The discussion is watered down because they solely want to look at it at the point of security. So I feel that, you know, it's time that things should move. It's time that people should speak up. And the saddest part to say is that during this COVID-19, when we look at the perspective of Malaysians in light of migrants, there was a lot of negative comment was being highlighted. Suddenly just kind of, you know, boomed and came up, which is also an aspect that I think we strongly need to deal with and, you know, need to address, because the Malaysian perspective is that looking at migrant workers, you know, as, you know, maybe like bringing in diseases and associated with crime, which is not a fact that is, it's not a fact. It cannot be proven. It is, in fact, research has not proven it. The crime rate committed by foreigners are very minimal. It's about only below 4%, but yet you see the image portrayed towards a migrant worker is so different. It's so negative, which is sad. I'll be happy to answer more questions, you know, if any direct questions, especially in terms of looking at us as a receiving country. Why do we see Malaysia? Why do we see that, you know, migration is a threat? You know, I would be happy to discuss this more later in the discussion. Thank
Florida,
you.
I like that you are asking yourself the question that I was just about to ask, because having lived in Malaysia myself, I've sort of always said this whenever I have the opportunity. I don't think I have been. I mean, there are few places in the world that feel like in your everyday life you have met several nationalities, and this place is Malaysia. I mean, from the minute you walk, you leave your home to enter into a grocery store, to walk into a small restaurant down the road to have your breakfast of roti canai, to the minute you finish getting your durian at the market and head back home, you would have encountered quite a number of migrant workers who are providing services along this way. So whether they're working in the service sector or they've come there to work in the informal sector, whichever way, as domestic domestic workers in construction as well, quite a large number that are coming. But yet you have these questions that you have raised as a receiving country. What really is the attitude of the local community to these migrants who provide very important services? And I think I wanted you to also make a little bit more comment in terms of sort of the criminalization that comes with the lack of identification or a lack of being documented. I think you saw the rise in the number of migrants being victims, if you like, for instance, of immigration raids, and that also meant that migrants had to choose, especially the undocumented ones, had to choose sometimes even more health risky behavior. So for instance, if they were living in one part of town, they had to find other friends that they would live with, and that meant social distancing, forget about that. And also in terms of ensuring that you can do any contact tracing when any of the migrants got COVID, became very difficult because of this criminalization of being undocumented. So I was hoping that you could also speak a little bit into that, and then and as well to just touch a bit on the gender aspect as well. What kind of do you sort of see some gaps, because you did talk about some opportunities, if we can, in the legislation that sort of allow also for female migrants to feel that they have access to a bit more protection. So let's say to legislation that goes more to protection of women.
Okay, in terms of the first question that you asked, why does the community, perceive migrant workers in this particular way? I can share some experience that I had when I was actually working with the union, and in what I saw there is that with the members, not necessarily in the leadership, but in the members, what I actually saw is that a lot of this negativity comes is because when you look at the workers, the local workers themselves, they are really left out in a lot of deals within themselves, benefits within themselves in terms of even salary, which is not up to their living needs. So when salaries are undermined, the first person they tend to see is that migrants are taking our jobs away and migrants are keeping our salary low. That is the perception that a lot of people tend to have, but they don't see it in the way that migrants are actually doing the job, in most cases, jobs that locals either do not wish to do it, or there is under supply of labor. So that aspect is not really being advocated, not being campaigned, and it's not been really being seen. But it is true that a lot of Malaysians, especially during COVID-19, when jobs was being slowing down and working hours has been slashed, salaries has been slashed, so they see the impact on themselves. And without looking into the real discussion and the real picture, they tend to divert, and unfortunately they tend to blame the migrant workers, which is not a good thing. So a lot of education needs to be done, a lot of promotion and campaign needs to be focused in this area. The second part, when you talk about criminalization, one of the things that civil society has been very highly advocating is that during COVID, especially, we know that the raid is going on. We know it's a constant thing. Raid is a constant thing. We had a lot of amnesties after amnesties, and unfortunately, we don't know. I would say that it may not have actually had a very great impact than it was expected, but one of the strongest advocacy made by civil society during this time is that it's not to arrest migrant worker, and they had a very valid point in saying that, because when you show and set an example of arresting migrant workers, many are going to flee away, and when they do that, if that person is asymptomatic person, there is a very high chance that the disease could be spread. But sad to say, that was not the decision it has been made. And when we're talking about, and civil society have also said criminalizing migrant workers is not the way forward to deter undocumented migrant workers. There are other steps that the government can actually take in order to reduce the number of undocumented migrant workers. And this is something that we would encourage more dialogue to take place with the government. And Ministry of Human Resource plays a very important role in and it's important to see where the position is also in terms of strategies. How do you reduce the number of undocumented? And it is also not an encouraging things for undocumented migrant workers to be in Malaysia, because they are being constantly put into a very vulnerable stage. Their salaries are not being paid, they do long hours of work, there's absolutely no rights and no benefits to protect them. So there must be an alternative to detention, and that is my very strong viewpoint. There is a way. It's just that how do we come forward to that? And in terms of gender, yes, there is a lot of gap in gender, and one big group of a large number of migrant workers, sectors of workers, the domestic workers, they are absolutely are being sidelined in terms of protection from the main, even though they are documented, and worse still if they're undocumented, as in terms of the labor protection, the existing labor protection that we have, it's very limited. To say that the protection is only given to them in terms of wages and in terms of termination benefits, but you don't see any other protection in that phase, and that opens to a lot of vulnerability towards domestic workers themselves, and a lot of complaints and abuses has been recorded through the MRCs that has been running in Malaysia, and the numbers are high. I was also being told that during the COVID-19, the fear of them bringing the disease to the other members of the family, what some did, they just took the migrant workers and just left them on the street on their own, with nowhere and no place to go, until some good people who saw them, good Samaritans who saw them and referred them to the organization who runs shelters for protection. So this was some of the challenges that is very highly faced by domestic workers themselves. I hope I have answered.
I think you have touched on the critical part of the answer, and I think we will come back to you in a bit.